Tonight, Canada is remembering former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The man who dominated politics in this country for almost a decade. Conservative, controversial, consequential.
We are doing it because it is right for Canada.
From Baie-Comeau to Parliament Hill, Mulroney shaped Canada and its place in the world. Tonight, those who supported him, opposed him, who reported on him, on his legacy.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada.
The policies, the man, and the leader.
From CBC News, this is The National with Hanomansing.
We have extensive coverage for you tonight as Canadians across this country pay tribute to Brian Mulroney after news broke this evening Canada's 18th Prime Minister had died at the age of 84. Mulroney was one of the longest-serving leaders in Canadian history, guiding this country for 9 years. That time included unpopular policies, including the implementation of a federal sales tax. But when faced with backlash, he stood by his decisions, saying they were necessary for Canada. Mulroney's daughter says he died peacefully today while surrounded by family. And this is the Canadian flag on Parliament Hill, where Mulroney spent so many years. It has been lowered to half-mast and will stay that way until sunset on the day of Mulroney's funeral or memorial service. Tonight, you'll hear from those who knew Mulroney well from across the political spectrum. But let's begin with our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, who looks back on Mulroney's life, his time in office, and why he evoked such strong emotions.
His very first foray into politics to become leader of the Progressive Conservative Party brought him a bitter loss. He channeled that bitterness into another leadership run 7 years later. That time, he won handily and renewed the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada with the largest majority in Canadian history at the time. Brian Mulroney created deep loyalties with those around him in unifying the party. Some of those loyalties were later tested and lost. Mulroney came from the small town of Baie-Comeau on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. Remote and isolated, he grew up in an Irish Catholic family, the son of an electrician at the local paper mill. But his ordinary upbringing was quickly overtaken by his extraordinary life. A close friendship with then U.S. President Ronald Reagan, what many saw as an attempt to change the relationship between Canada and the United States, and a first step towards a free trade agreement between the two countries, something Mulroney had initially opposed. In fact, free trade became the center point of Mulroney's pivotal second federal election in 1988.
Our message is clear. Canada is open for business again.
Bitterly fought, it became about Canadian patriotism.
You've sold us out. I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
Mulroney won his second majority, leaving him lots of room to move forward with bold and potentially controversial ideas, including bringing in the much-disliked GST.
We are doing it because it is right for Canada. It must be done.
As a son of La Belle Province, Mulroney also made promises to recognize Quebec as a distinct society, and he sought to complete something his predecessor and political nemesis Pierre Trudeau failed to do: attempt to win Quebec's signature on Canada's repatriated constitution. That kicked off years of negotiations with the provinces, starting with the Meech Lake Accord. But as it moved towards ratification, some provincial governments had now changed and were suddenly no longer on board.
I believe it's about time that you allow the Aboriginal people to be heard.
A one-day meeting turned into a week-long, last-ditch effort to save the agreement that ultimately failed.
It's a sad day for Canada. This was all about Canada, about the unity of our country.
The disappointment turned to anger from some conservative Quebec MPs who left to form the Bloc Québécois, including one of Mulroney's close friends, Lucien Bouchard. Mulroney never forgave him. And Western Canadians, too, began to feel left out, leading Preston Manning to create the Reform Party, both leading to damaging splits within the Conservative movement down the road. Mulroney's second attempt to get Quebec to sign on to the Constitution came in the form of the Charlottetown Accord. It also failed in 1992 after being put to a referendum. It was the end of a quarter century of constitutional reform in this country, and it was more fodder for those who simply were ready to move on from the Mulroney era. Yet, he still had work to do.
If there are not fundamental changes in South Africa, we are prepared to invoke total sanctions against that country and its repressive regime.
Pressuring international partners to denounce the apartheid in South Africa and free Nelson Mandela. It won Mulroney worldwide praise and a visit from a grateful and free Mandela just months after his release. Mulroney signed the Acid Rain Accord with the United States in 1991, earning him kudos from environmentalists. But Canada had wearied of Mulroney after a turbulent 9 years, and he left politics in 1993.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada in the long term, not what could be politically popular in the short term.
What followed was the start of a long Liberal reign. His successor, Kim Campbell, managed to win only 2 seats. His years after politics were marked with some embarrassing legal battles, including questions about his relationship with the German businessman Karl-Heinz Schreiber, resulting in an inquiry. Mulroney did admit to accepting $250,000 from Schreiber for consulting.
I was fighting for my life and the honor of my family.
The inquiry found the former Prime Minister's dealings with Schreiber were inappropriate and not ethical. Mulroney called it the worst mistake of his life and set to rebuild his reputation. Conservatives once again sought his counsel or his blessing, and the Liberal successor to his old foe, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, counted on his advice during negotiations around NAFTA 2.0. Even in the moments when Mulroney knew he was strongly disliked by many Canadians for his decisions, he believed strongly in why he was doing it.
In the fullness of time, history and a more reflective nation will tell us whether our hopes for the ultimate success of these policies were in fact realized.
Mulroney marked the history of this country time and time again, and now in his passing, Canadians may reflect on just how much he gave and how much he changed their country.
And Rosie, your thoughts on this night?
Brian Mulroney was a prime minister who wanted to make big changes, Ian, and some of them succeeded, like NAFTA, and others failed, like those constitutional reforms. What you will hear, I think, though, throughout tonight and the next number of days is about Brian Mulroney's humanity, that he cared about the people around him, that he cared about his own MPs, and that he sure liked to pick up the phone and call people. And once he picked up the phone and called you, you were stuck talking to him for quite some time. I'll give you 2 little personal anecdotes. One, when Ed Broadbent died about 6 weeks ago, I emailed him. He was not an emailer, he was a phone caller, and I asked if he would have some comments. He called me back immediately, even though at the time he was in hospital and struggling with his own health issues, and he made sure to find a quiet spot in the hospital so that he could pay tribute to his opponent. And I'll give you one more anecdote. Lucien Bouchard, the man who he was very upset with when he left and went off to form the Bloc Québécois, well, he was on Radio-Canada tonight, and he said that in the past 6 months, the 2 men had finally reconciled their friendship.
And Rosemary, you'll be back in a few minutes with a special At Issue. Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton in Ottawa. Well, we're hearing so much reaction to Mulroney's death tonight from those who admired him, worked alongside him, and faced off against him. Rafi Bouchikanian takes us through some of those tributes.
Prime Minister, great to see you.
One of Brian Mulroney's oldest opponents, but Jean Chrétien revealed shouting across the political divide was years behind them.
We would tease each other. You will poke fun at me, I will poke fun at him. And, we will, as I say, we have to not to take ourselves too seriously. We have to take the job very seriously. We tend, when we talk privately like that, to talk about memories that we share. And as I said earlier, we have many coming from rural Quebec.
Not just home for them, but a key part in Mulroney's big bet in coming to power.
His greatest success was to break in Quebec. And it was was his argument when he ran, and it turned out to be right.
Prime Minister Trudeau, who saw Mulroney last summer at one of his last public events, also praised him and noted how he has relied on his advice far past when Mulroney held office.
He was incredibly generous and effective in advising me and our government on the renegotiation of NAFTA during some very challenging years, where not just the advice and strategic counsel he gave me and us, but also active with his contacts as part of Team Canada to make sure that the messages on how important the friendship and the relationship between Canada and the U.S. was, not just for Canada but the U.S., was key.
Mulroney also nurtured personal relationships, like with former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, who just visited him in Florida this weekend.
He was very weak, but already at that time he said to me, I'm not sure I'm going to finish the year. And I tried to convince him of the contrary, telling him, listen, this is the 40th anniversary of the election of his government. And that he had in front of him a number of events that we needed to organize to celebrate his legacy.
And from the Conservatives' current leader,
the lesson I take from Brian Mulroney is to always remember humble beginnings. He started as the son of an electrician in a working-class Baie-Comeau neighborhood. He worked like crazy to get himself a good education and pay his way through law school. But no matter how high he rose in politics, he remembered those humble beginnings. He remembered the struggle of his parents to put food on the table.
That legacy's importance echoed by Trudeau.
He shaped our past, but he shapes our present, and he will impact our future as well.
Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper is also remembering Brian Mulroney. He wrote, "History will record that Mr. Mulroney's premiership was transformational. Canada has lost a historic figure, and we mourn his passing with all his many friends and associates." Oh, we saw Jean Charest in Rafi's story, elected in the Tories' landslide victory in 1984. Charest went on to serve in Mulroney's cabinet. He later led the Progressive Conservative Party himself and served as the Premier of Quebec. And Jean Charest joins us from Montreal tonight. Jean, thank you for speaking to us on this
Thank you, Ian.
difficult night for so many people. I want you to take us back to when you were a young cabinet minister working alongside Brian Mulroney. What was he like at that point in his career?
I was elected in '84. I was 26 years old. I had supported Joe Clark in the leadership race. And so the Mulroney clan and the nomination, they weren't favorable to my candidacy, but I got through. And then we got to know each other, and he took me under his wing. And I became a minister at a very young age. And I remember Ian very fondly that moment, because he asked me where my wife was, and he said to me, I would have never been Prime Minister of Canada without Mila. And I remember the gesture. He said, we're like this. And he asked me where my dad was, and because he had lost his dad at a very young age. And he was an extraordinary person in that respect. As a leader of a party, I don't think there's anyone who has reached the pinnacle that he reached as a leader of a party. As a prime minister, he was courageous, transformational for the country. And he lived in a period where he felt that governments and leaders had to make difficult decisions that were sometimes unpopular, carry them, defend them, and if you got the politics right, you would get through them. So he changed our country. He changed our lives. And those who served with him, all those who served with him, remember him very fondly.
And people, Jean, who may be too young to remember or maybe have not thought about it very much over the last few decades, tell us a bit about Mulroney's strength as a leader, because he created this coalition that included Conservatives from Quebec and from the West and ended up with that huge majority in the first election win.
His basic argument in the leadership race against Mr. Clark in 1983 was, how are you tired of losing? And we as a party need to be able to have support in Quebec, and I can deliver that. He delivered that in spades. He reached out to Quebec. The Meech Lake Accords were done for Canada, not just for Quebec. I mean, this perception, it was done for all of Canada because he felt we needed to fix this if we were going to go forward. And so in that respect, he was exceptional. And then as a party leader, he reached out to all of the country. You know, it was interesting, Ian, you'd go to a caucus meeting and at the end of the mandate, I mean, we had been through a lot of difficult issues. Country was a bit worn out by all the debates. And he would, when he was in caucus, when he spoke to caucus, everyone would show up. That's how compelling he was. We'd walk out of that room, we were at 15% in the polls, and the media thought, you know, they looked at us, they thought they must be on drugs. It's as though they're on 60% of the polls. But that's how powerful he was as a leader. And that allowed him to get a lot of things done. So in that respect, those who worked with him will forever remember an exceptional and a very generous man.
We have about a minute left. Of course, by the end of his time in politics, he left a depleted Conservative Party. You were part of that, just 2 seats in the House of Commons, and then you ended up becoming the leader of that party. I don't know what connection he had to you then, but as you look back at the highs and the lows of the Mulroney Conservatives, what would you say his legacy is?
Well, he did change the party. He had a very activist agenda and very transformational. And when he left power, admittedly, the government in the country was partly worn out. When I became leader of the party, he was very supportive of everything we did. I saw him last Saturday, and I had, I went to Florida because he wanted to chat, and I saw him Saturday. And I wanted, we talked about preparing events to celebrate his legacy of the last, because this is the 40th anniversary. And so I hope that'll happen this year, because there's a lot of good things to remember about Brian Mulroney and what he's done for us and what he's done for our country.
Jean Charest, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, let's bring in former CBC News chief correspondent and host of The National, Peter Mansbridge, who covered Brian Mulroney over the years many times. And Peter, first of all, some reflections on the former Prime Minister's passing.
Well, we knew that his health had been a challenge for him these last couple of years. The last time I was back and forth with him was just a couple of months ago. And, you know, he knew the difficulties he was facing, but he was convinced that he was going to power through. You know, unfortunately, these health issues took his time away from him today. Listen, he's a major figure on the Canadian political landscape. Was he without failures in his political life? No, not at all. I mean, there were some issues that haunted him a long time. But there were other things that put him on that landscape in a significant way. I mean, 2 majority governments, there are not a lot of prime ministers who can say they got 2 back-to-back majority governments, including the biggest one in Canadian history in 1984. He pushed through free trade. It was a divisive debate, but I think most people, not all, but most people argued that it helped establish Canada on an economic front in a different way, given the free trade successes. You know, the GST was something that was a problem in terms of selling it, but at the same time, it was something that future governments were greatly thankful for, including the Liberal government that followed the Mulroney era. But I think most significantly for him was on the world stage, was his pushing for South Africa and Nelson Mandela. He pushed Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan into accepting the idea of Mandela being released from jail and eventually the end of apartheid. That wasn't easy. That's never been forgotten by the South Africans. I was in South Africa at the time of the funeral for Nelson Mandela, and I'm telling you, Brian Mulroney was welcomed in South Africa as a hero.
You, of course, were there during the major political events for Brian Mulroney, including those 2 majority election wins, but you must have spent time with him away from the camera as a journalist. And I just wonder what you can tell us about Brian Mulroney as a person.
Well, the way he appeared sometimes on television was not the way you saw him in real life. He was a funny guy. He was he liked to kid around with journalists, and sometimes that bit him in the back because some journalists, respecting the rules of the game, reported some of the things he was saying, and that caused him problems. But he was a guy who never forgot his friends. I'll tell you a quick story. When his agriculture minister, John Wise, passed away, Mulroney was in China, not as prime minister. This is in his post-political days. I reached out to let him know because both he and I knew John Wise separately. And I wanted him to know that his minister had passed away. He arranged with the minister of the church that was conducting the funeral to have a call from him piped in without anybody else knowing in the church. Only the minister knew. And he regaled the audience in the way only Mulroney could with stories about John Wise. That's the kind of guy he was. He never forgot a friend. He never forgot a political ally. And he never forgot some of his political enemies either, reaching out and making friends with them over time. So listen, this was a guy who I said, you just have to mention the word Airbus, and people will know that there were problems on the Mulroney side too. But there were major accomplishments, and those shouldn't be forgotten in a guy who was on the landscape, political landscape of this country for a long time.
Peter, appreciate your recollections of the former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Take care.
As we go to break, some images of Brian Mulroney throughout his life and career. Our coverage continues with a special ad issue, as well as a conversation with a man who knew him well, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, when The National continues. Let's return to our top story. Breaking tonight, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has died. He was 84 years old. Mulroney was Prime Minister for 9 years, from 1984 to 1993. He's being remembered tonight by people across the political spectrum as a statesman and a gentleman. Our coverage will continue throughout the hour. But first, we want to turn to the other big story in Ottawa tonight, a major piece of legislation that will affect millions of Canadians. A national Pharmacare plan to cover contraception and diabetes drugs and supplies for all Canadians. Marina von Stackelberg lays out the new details for us tonight.
Where an insulin pump.
Rebecca Redmond spends up to $1,000 on medication every month to stay alive. The cost means the type 1 diabetic often has to ration her insulin. Soon, she might not need to.
I think it's going to help me, and it's going to help a lot of other people across the country, and that's what really matters to me.
This is about health equity.
Canada's health minister has now introduced the legislation laying the groundwork for universal drug coverage. To start, the federal government will cover diabetes medication and devices and birth control.
This is a proof of concept opportunity to try on 2 drugs on a universal single-payer model.
But the legislation does not commit Ottawa to cover all drugs.
And it seems that this was a compromise. You know, there's not a rational reason to restrict publicly funded medicines to diabetes and contraceptives. It does not make sense from a health perspective.
Ottawa pledges to create a list of essential drugs it may eventually cover and an agency to bulk purchase medications within 1 year of the legislation passing, which it likely will with support from the NDP. They've pushed the Liberal government to bring in Pharmacare.
It also sets a structure for builds a foundation for further expansion down in the future for governments that want to go there, and of course the New Democrats. If we're government, we would want to go there.
The cost to cover those 2 types of drugs?
Maybe $1.5 billion. Like, I think it's, the question is it going to be lower than that? Is it going to be a little bit higher?
The health minister says Canadians could start getting their diabetes medication and birth control paid for as early as next year. But to get there, he'll first have to negotiate funding deals with the provinces and territories. So far, Alberta and Quebec have both said they're not interested in the plan. Marina von Stackelberg, CBC News, Ottawa.
Brian Mulroney was no stranger to juggling negotiations with the provinces. When we come back, Rosie and Ad Issue will look at his political legacy. The National is back right after the break. There are conflicting accounts tonight of what led to a deadly incident in Gaza. More than 100 Palestinians were killed as an aid convoy arrived in the north. Sasha Petrusik takes us through the desperation, the chaos, and the accusations.
In northern Gaza, the need for aid is urgent, the crowds desperate, facing what the UN calls imminent famine. Throwing ourselves toward death, he says, for a couple of kilos of flour. As aid trucks finally arrived, video from an Israeli drone shows them swarmed. What happened next is still unclear, but the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 100 civilians were killed, many others injured, some accusing Israeli soldiers of shooting at them. They kept firing toward us, he says. There are so many dead. Israeli officials dispute that.
No IDF strike was conducted towards the aid convoy.
This tank did fire a warning shot in the air, he says, but the crowd's to blame.
Some began violently pushing and even trampling other Gazans to death, looting the humanitarian supplies.
Still, a different military spokesman said soldiers did fire at Gazans.
So when people that are perceived as a threat continue to move forward towards the forces, despite the warning shots, the threat is still perceived. And indeed, there's a handful of people that have been killed in this incident.
There is concern in the U.S.
We are urgently seeking additional information on exactly what took place.
Washington's been pushing for a deal for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. U.S. President Joe Biden was asked if this incident complicates negotiations. I know it will. It's also brought more criticism of Israeli military actions from the UN and from Canada.
I think the violence must stop. I think civilians can not be targeted.
An anguish from this Palestinian builder who now spends all his time making graves. I'm fed up, he says. I want to go back to rebuilding Gaza. When that will be possible, even less certain now, as calls for a full investigation into this incident grow louder. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Toronto.
We're going to take you back to Ottawa now, where so many are sharing their memories of Brian Mulroney. It's over to Rosie with a special edition of At Issue.
Tonight, Brian Mulroney is being remembered for his dedication, his passion, his love for this country.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada.
Politicians and average Canadians alike are reflecting on his legacy and on word that Canada's 18th Prime Minister has died. Mulroney's tenure was at points controversial, but also consequential, both in Canada and around the world. Joining me now to look back at Brian Mulroney's legacy, a special At Issue, Andrew Coyne, Tonda McCharles, and Rob Russo. Thank you all for doing this. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. What do you think Brian Mulroney changed about this country? What was the most significant change he brought to Canada?
Oh, I think by all accounts, it would be the free trade agreement. People have to remember, before free trade, if you proposed free trade with the United States, people would look at you like you had two heads. How could we possibly survive against the colossus to our south? It was obviously a big policy change, but it was as much a change in our outlook, in our sense of ourselves, our confidence in ourselves. It's remarkable that he attempted it, of course, having run against it for the leadership. And being by nature, I think, more of a cautious pragmatist. But I think what you can really say about Mulroney is when circumstances require that you make a big bet, when you push in all your chips, he did. And that's a remarkable testament that he was able to do that.
And that's sort of who he was, Tonda, wasn't it? He put all his chips on the table if he believed in what he was doing.
No incrementalist, right? He's not the conservative that Stephen Harper once was, in the sense that he took big chances, big leaps, as Andrew said, and not just in the constitutional sphere, but in the economic sphere, in the environmental sphere, on the world stage. And so his legacy spans a whole range of files. But yet, when you talk to people tonight, some of his, then arch enemies and political rivals and his friends, everybody remembers him as the person, the consummate politician with skill and acumen who reached out to people.
And how did that contribute to his success, Rob, as someone who covered him?
He was relentless in establishing relationships. Andrew talked about the relationship with the United States. It fundamentally changed even before free trade. And in fact, we got to free trade because he had an extraordinary relationship with U.S. presidents that Canadian prime ministers had stiff-armed, were wary of, or incapable of establishing before he got there, to the point where the chiefs of staff for both Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush used to say, could you please allow me to deal with Canada? Because Reagan would say, we have to do something for Brian. So this was a man who knew the value of the relationship, whether it was at the caucus level when he was at 12% and his caucus never left him, or at the summit of global affairs. He had those relationships, maintained them, and was able to advance his interests because of them. And in some cases, those relationships also turned on him and caused him some of his biggest miseries.
Andrew, he tried all those things, and as Rob said, had good relationships. Are there lessons there that, and certainly he tried to give advice to people, but are there lessons there that other leaders should be taking from Mulroney, and what would they be, do you think?
For good and ill. Yes, I mean, he was adept at building up political capital. He certainly, in that first election, won 211 seats, but he was also willing to spend it as the case may be. Now, some of those risks were probably not worth taking. I think Meech Lake was ill-advised, and the country is probably better off for it not having succeeded. But if you never try, you're never going to succeed. If you don't take any risks, you're not going to have much to show for it. And so to see a Conservative Prime Minister in particular tackling those kinds of big things that we really have sort of forgotten, I think, certainly on the Conservative side, of really trying to actually change things rather than just incrementalism. I think that's a remarkable thing as an example to hold up that other Conservative leaders in particular can emulate.
Tonda?
Look, I'm struck by a common thread through all his years and all the big projects he worked on, and that was he had also a supreme confidence in his own ability of persuasion and his ability to persuade his rivals that his way was right. I first encountered Brian Mulroney in 1985 when he bravely sort of marched out onto the lawn of Parliament to confront a group of seniors who were protesting his plan to de-index their pensions. And Mulroney thought he could win that battle. Well, that battle was he was trumped in that match by a little tiny senior named Solange Denis, but also that he dialed back his decision to de-index pensions. That gave actually rise to a young Conservative staffer, Stephen Harper, who became very disillusioned with Brian Mulroney's conservatism brand, who went back to Alberta and later went on to be a key player in the Reform Party and the modern-day Conservative Party, which is not Brian Mulroney's Conservative Party, a very different party.
The counterexample would be from the 1988 election, which was fought over free trade, which they initially tried to low bridge, as they say. They tried to make it like it was no big deal. And they weren't getting very far, and John Turner scared the pants off of people. And the turning point really was he ran into two elderly protesters, I think it was in Victoria, BC, who were heckling him during his speech. And he said, look, if you let me finish my speech, I'll sit down and debate with you. And he did, and the cameras were rolling and everything else. And I think it really changed the whole tenor at that point. People could look at that and go, okay, at last we know what Brian Mulroney believes in. He really seems to believe in this free trade deal.
Rob?
I'm struck by a couple of other things. Tonda was saying earlier about how he alienated Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper and every Conservative leader after him wore a very well-worn path in the carpet to Brian Mulroney's Westmount home to seek his advice. Every Conservative leader afterwards, or Conservative aspirant, went to look for advice from Brian Mulroney. And why? Because he had the secret sauce. Conservatives, really after the conscription debate in the First World War, Conservatives were a hiccup of history when they were elected in Canada between the early part of the century and 1984. He made people realize in the Conservative Party that you had to deal with Quebec, you had to embrace Quebec, you had to speak to Quebec in their own language, in French, and you had to embrace Quebec culture as part of Canada if you wanted to succeed as a Conservative Party. And I think every Conservative leader has tried that since. So he was consequential in terms of the place of Quebec in the country, even with the failure of Meech Lake, I would say. A lot of what was in Meech Lake has come to pass in many, many ways, whether you agreed with it or not. It sees itself as a distinct society. primarily in French. That's all because of the carpentry that was hammered by Brian Mulroney.
Well, I was listening to Lucien Bouchard, who he apparently has reconciled with on Radio-Canada today, and he said that one of the things that people didn't understand about him was how sensitive a man he was. And I wonder, Andrew, without getting into the psychology of Brian Mulroney, whether there were things that stood in his way because of some of that, and because he valued these personal relationships and things that he didn't get to do because of that.
I think that was part of his difficulty politically was he needed to be loved too much. And people, I think the public could sense that. There was a kind of an unctuousness to him, a trying too hard to please kind of quality that, unfairly perhaps, but politics is an unfair business, people kind of recoiled from it. So he was in some ways supremely self-confident, but I think there was an insecurity to underlay it.
Tonda?
When I spoke to Clyde Wells tonight, the Newfoundland Premier who confronted him over the Meech Lake Accord, and basically Mulroney and David Peterson blamed Clyde Wells for its failure, but it's a more complex story than that. We don't have time for. But Clyde Wells, said that he always knew that Brian Mulroney had at the heart of his objectives a better Canada. He was dedicated to the country, and I don't think anyone really ever questioned that. Even when he was office, he left office, with low opinion numbers in the public opinion polls, and Tonight, all the reviews you're hearing of his legacy, it all speaks to he had a firm idea, and it was to better Canada. And I don't think that is anything anyone will take away from him.
No matter what kinds of challenges he put in front of him himself too, Rob, because he did that to himself sometimes too with his choices.
Yes, I think both Tonda and Andrew raised an interesting point about who he was as a human being. He was, I think, the first son of a working class father to become prime minister. That led to no end of insecurities, I'm sure. But what a wonderful subject to cover as a reporter. A swashbuckling, rollicking, warts and all prime minister who was going to make big bets. And it was just a joy to cover this guy, even when you felt the Arctic gale, as many of us did, from Mulroney when he was mad at you. He really, really cared about what reporters thought of him. So as a journalist, as a young journalist in particular, fascinating subject and a wonderful subject to cover as well.
Yeah, and a man who I think we all agree believed in his vision for Canada and was willing to do an awful lot for it, including make some big personal sacrifices as well. Thank you all for your reflections on him tonight and what you knew about him and covering him. I appreciate it very much. Andrew, Tonda, and Rob. Thanks, guys. And with that, I'll send things back to Ian.
Rosie, great work throughout the day covering this story. Next, I'll speak with those who knew Mulroney well. As a political foe and a friend, Jean Chrétien remembers Brian Mulroney. That's next. Tonight, we're remembering the life and legacy of Brian Mulroney, a political force. And as Canada's 18th Prime Minister, he had many opponents across the aisle in the House of Commons. Jean Chrétien was one of them.
Is it now a new idea that should become part of the Tory program very soon? Bravo!
We're going to move it to
I thought the last thing that I heard my honourable friend say was that he was going to eliminate the GST.
We're joined now by former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Mr. Chrétien, thank you very much for joining us. And what was your reaction when you heard the news of the passing of Brian Mulroney?
Well, I was not surprised because he was sick since quite a long time, and I had many occasions to talk to him while he was at hospital or home, and he was fighting very hard to stay alive, and he was very courageous, and eventually he had to go, and it's a sad occasion for his family. He was a very good father and husband, and had a great family, and he was a very important prime minister in Canada for a very turbulent period of Canada. And he was an opponent of mine. We were across the aisle, but we had a lot of things in common. We both believe in Canada. We had different means to achieve the goal, to make Canada better. And But being in politics, we can be opponents and not necessarily enemies. And we had a lot of things in common because we were both from rural Quebec. He was from Bécomo, I was from Shawinigan. We both studied at Laval University. I was from a minority, he was too, because he was an Anglophone in Quebec. So we had a lot of things in common, but we did not belong to the same political institution.
I think it says something about the civility of politics in your era that the two of you could be opponents on the House of Commons floor and yet still have a friendship outside of that. And I find it very intriguing that the two of you shared phone calls in the last few months. I know that you shared stories about your backgrounds in Quebec, but I wonder if you can tell us anything more about what you and former Prime Minister Mulroney spoke about on the phone.
Well, we never discussed political issues. We were talking mainly about the life, the past, what we tease each other about some situation and so on. It was not any political discussion at that time that were needed.
What should we know about Brian Mulroney? What do you know about him that maybe we would not have seen on the television camera?
Oh, today there is not many things secret. Everything you see, it's what is the reality. Everybody looks for some very secret thing. There is very little of that in life. There was some times when we had very difficult disappointment or opposing views, but we expressed them generally in public, and the public was aware, and the public passed the judgments.
How should we remember Brian Mulroney tonight?
That public service is a very honorable thing to do. He did that in a different way. He was involved in the Young Conservatives, but all his life he was in what we talk about the back with the group of organizing the party and the election and so on. He came from outside, directly Prime Minister. He had no political experience in the House of Commons when he became Prime Minister in '84. I think he was in the House for a year and a half maximum. And while I was 30 years a member of Parliament before I became Prime Minister. But he had made a contribution while practicing law in his own way as a citizen. And I encourage a lot of people to look at him for that. You don't have to be elected to make a contribution.
Well, on this sad day, it's really nice to hear the reflections of one former Prime Minister speaking of another. Mr. Chrétien, thank you very much for speaking with us.
My pleasure, and offer my condolence to his wife and his beautiful family. They can be proud of him.
We've heard from so many people who knew and worked closely with Brian Mulroney, but perhaps the most important voice is Mulroney himself.
You win some and lose some, and you can't worry about the criticisms.
Brian Mulroney, in his own words, is next. Brian Mulroney was one of the longest-serving prime ministers, and during that time, he was unafraid to tackle the most challenging issues. Throughout the night, we've been hearing from his friends and family, but who was he in his own words? As we say goodnight, we want to end on some of the highlights of his career, the legacy of 9 years as Prime Minister.
Brian Mulroney, 1,584.
And together, as Conservatives and Canadians, we're going to reconstruct that grand alliance of West and East, English and French, new Canadians and old, and we are going to make a commitment to unity, to change, to growth and prosperity that's going to mean new days and new hopes and better tomorrows for all Canadians.
You do not have a monopoly on patriotism, and I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
If Canada, middle power, doesn't stand for human rights and the defense of human rights and individual liberties, then what do we stand for? All I'm concerned about is making certain that Canada turns out to have been on the right side of history.
I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada.